Imagine a king once praised as the conqueror of the continent, the one who dared to challenge the Pope and establish his own church. That was Henry VIII, the man who held the throne of England, his power stretching across 16th century Europe. Yet behind the crimson cloak and the glittering crown lay a horrifying truth. His body slowly turned into a rotting prison, plagued by bizarre, grotesque hygiene habits, so dangerous they transformed the splendid palace into a pit of disease, stench, and dread, from allowing thousands of maggots to live inside the necrotic wounds on his leg, to using fox fur as a diaper, or forcing queens to endure public virginity rituals right in the middle of court. All of it turned Henry VIII into a symbol of decay, where absolute power walked hand in hand with the corruption of body and mind. Tonight, we will step into the darkness of the Tudor palace to uncover the most horrifying hygiene practices of Henry VIII. Secrets history wished to bury, but which still have the power to send shivers down our spine even today. Henry VIII, the monarch who once made all of Europe tremble, carried within him a bizarre belief. He thought that water was the enemy of health. Every drop of bathing, according to him, opened a doorway for disease to invade the body, and so, within the splendid Tudor palace of crystal chandeliers and luxurious velvet carpets, there existed a horrifying truth. The king could go for many weeks, even entire months, without ever touching water. His body gradually became a wall covered with rotting moss. Sweat accumulated day after day, hardened into layers of white salty crust, dry and sharp like sea salt on stone. His garments, once made of the finest velvets, after being soaked in sweat and dirt, clung tightly to his skin, stiff like the rough bark of a tree, making every movement creak like rusty armor. The stench from Henry's body was no longer just an unpleasant detail, but a constant horror. It spread through the palace corridors, seeped into the red velvet drapes and the carpets, turning the dazzling palace into something like a damp cellar. Courtiers, every time summoned for an audience, had to keep their distance, holding sachets of rosemary or bundles of dried flowers close to their noses. Hand fans of feathers, once meant for elegance, had now become tools of survival. The physicians of that time, with their limited knowledge, were helpless. They looked at the cracked skin, the redness, the spreading sores along the king's body, unable to persuade him to change. Each time they offered a recommendation, they received only his cold frown in return, like a suspended sentence hanging above their heads. And so, beneath the lavish exterior of the Tudor court, with its extravagant feasts, its resounding music, and its absolute power, there was hidden a body slowly rotting in darkness. A king who, instead of cleansing, chose to let his foul stench become the invisible robe draped over his throne. In his later years, gout and the necrotic ulcers on his legs left Henry VIII with almost no control over his body. He often suffered from incontinence right in the middle of banquets or while receiving ambassadors. To conceal this humiliation, the court devised for the king something they gave a grand name, the royal diaper. Unlike the coarse cloth diapers of common folk, this one was made of fox fur, soft, warm, and long seen as a symbol of luxury and power. Yet that very opulence turned into a nightmare. The thick, damp fur trapped everything inside urine, sweat, and the pus seeping from the festering wounds on the king's legs. All of it soaked deep into the fur, then released a heavy, suffocating stench so strong that even the lightest breeze could fill an entire chamber with the acrid reek of an animal pen. No courtier dared come near. Whenever Henry moved through the great hall, the nobles stepped back a few paces, pressing themselves against the walls, bowing while trying to breathe through perfumed handkerchiefs. Audiences that should have been solemn now became grotesque scenes of lords waving fans and covering their faces with sachets of herbs. While the king hunched in his luxurious yet death-scented diaper, each change of diaper was a torment for the entire palace. Maids had to carefully remove the soaked fox fur, wash it in bronze basins with soap, perfumes, and rare herbs, then hang it outside to dry, scent it with oils, and finally return it to the king. This routine repeated day after day, turning the magnificent Tudor palace into a vast deodorizing workshop, where all anyone could do was sigh in the stench that never truly disappeared. Tragically, the man who once sat on England's throne, who could decide the fate of tens of thousands, was ultimately betrayed by his own body. The image of Henry VIII in a crimson cloak, but beneath it wearing a damp fur diaper, became a symbol of decline, a mighty king reduced to a frail, helpless state, like a crippled child. And the smell of that diaper, even drenched in costly perfumes, still haunts the cold stone corridors of the palace, a chilling reminder of the truth the court longed to hide. While other kings sought strength from swords or religious rituals, Henry VIII believed in a brutal folk remedy, raw garlic. He was convinced that within each pungent clove lay the power to ward off evil spirits, neutralise poison, and protect his body from every plot of assassination. Thus, at his meals, Henry did not merely add a few thin slices like common folk, but chewed entire bulbs, even whole clusters of garlic. With the hunger of a man desperate for power, the sight chilled everyone. Amid the golden glow of candles at grand banquets, as nobles raised their glasses of fine wine, savoring roasted venison and delicate stews, the king sat upon his throne, gnawing raw cloves, papery skins drifting down onto velvet carpets, shards of garlic crunching beneath his decayed teeth. Each bite released cloudy greenish juice, spraying forth a stench as acrid as sulfur smoke. A single breath from Henry was enough to shatter the atmosphere. Courtiers seated nearby had to hold their breath or discreetly push their chairs back, forming a hollow circle around the throne. They described the odor as the breath of a newly opened tomb, sharp, rancid, and so foul it burned the eyes and clenched the throat. But Henry did not stop there. Believing wholeheartedly in garlic's power, he ordered bulbs to be crushed, their juice squeezed and smeared directly onto the necrotic ulcers on his legs. As the caustic liquid seeped into festering wounds, he howled in the night, his cries mingling with thunder outside the window, echoing through Westminster. The royal physicians, powerless and terrified, could only prostrate themselves and present more basins of garlic, as though it were a sacred rite that none dared defy. The result was not healing but disaster. The wounds grew swollen, inflamed, pus-filled, and spread further than ever. The stench of rotting flesh, fused with the acrid bite of raw garlic, created a horror so unbearable that even the toughest guards had to cover their noses, eyes watering as they passed the king's chamber. In the darkness, Henry VIII still believed he was protecting himself with folk medicine. In truth, each raw clove only revealed more of his decay, a king once mighty, now enslaved by superstition, transforming the Tudor palace into a tomb steeped in garlic and the reek of putrid flesh. If eating raw garlic had already suffocated the entire Tudor palace, then Henry VIII's breath was the true nightmare. Teeth that had once been bright white in his youth, after years of drowning in wine, red meat, and the daily habit of chewing raw garlic, had turned into a pile of broken fragments. Loose and dark brown, his gums swelled and festered, each bite releasing drops of foul liquid. And when all of this, combined with the pungent stench of garlic, it created an invisible weapon, a breath of death. Each time Henry parted his lips, the entire room felt struck by a blast of poison smoke. Foreign ambassadors recorded that, even sitting 3 steps away, one could still smell the stench of decay, like a corpse left forgotten. At banquets, When the king raised his cup for a toast, all the guests set their glasses down at once, turned their faces away, and held back their breath. Young nobles even pretended to cough violently just to leave the table, desperate to escape the torment. The courtiers, powerless against this odor, devised every possible method, stuffing mint into their mouths, carrying slices of citrus in their pockets, or soaking handkerchiefs in rose oil, but all proved useless. A single breath from the king was enough to wipe out every trace of delicate fragrance, replacing it with a wave of stench, acrid like sulfur, rancid like rotting flesh, and sickly sweet like honey mixed with pus. Yet to Henry, this was proof of his strength. He once declared that this foul breath was his natural shield, a toxic aura that rendered any attempt at poisoning useless. He believed no one would dare come close enough to strike, and that the deathly fumes from his mouth were themselves a sign of power. But to his attendants, it was not a shield, but torment. It was said that each time he laughed, pus dripped from between his teeth, falling onto tablecloths or spraying across his robes. The king's laughter, which should have rung out as commanding and majestic, only made others shudder, for it carried the very taste of decay. And so, Henry VIII's breath was not merely the consequence of his diet and disease, but became a symbol of decline. It reminded all who were present that behind the glitter of royal authority, the king who once forced the church itself to bow was now nothing more than a ruined body, exhaling death with every word he spoke. In the history of dynasties, few rituals were as bizarre and terrifying as the habit Henry VIII imposed upon his court, the inspection of his own feces. Each day, before dawn's light filtered through the smoke-stained glass, and again when darkness fell over the palace, the royal physicians knelt outside the king's chamber with pristine white porcelain bowls, crafted solely to receive the samples of royalty. Once Henry had finished, the bowls were immediately sealed and carried down to the dungeons beneath the palace. There, the faint glow of torches only served to highlight the blotched stains on damp stone walls, while the air was thick with ammonia, rot, and a stench as foul as bubbling swamp mud. In this place, the physicians, pale-faced behind veils covering their noses, were forced to analyze with absolute precision color, odor, consistency, liquidity. Every detail had to be meticulously recorded in leather-bound volumes, sealed with the red insignia of the crown. One mistake, and they could lose their position. Worse still, death lurked just beyond the door. A single vague description, a phrasing that failed to satisfy the king, was enough to turn a physician into a traitor. For Henry, feces did not merely reflect health, but also the spirit of the throne. Over time, the storage chamber ceased to be a site of medical study and became a prison of the senses. The royal doctors recalled how, in the mouldy darkness, dozens of porcelain bowls stood side by side, releasing acrid fumes that made them cough and weep. On some days, the sound of lids being lifted echoed like dragging chains, followed by a poisonous vapor rising to choke their throats. Many collapsed on the stone floor, dragged outside half-conscious, as though emerging from a chamber of torture. To Henry, it was a scientific ritual to preserve royal health, but to all who took part, it was a nightmare. The Tudor palace, once renowned for its lavish banquets, was now haunted by the stench of feces, blood, and pus, as if it were no longer a glorious court, but a perverse torture camp, where power was measured by the humiliation of others.